introduced ourselves. I'm Jeremy Ive. I'm a vicar in Kent, but I've also been senior, and I am senior advisor to RPI. I worked closely with Michael in his many visits to Korea, and in the book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea. But I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who's Matthew Ferguson, who's a law solicitor. Young Gil, greetings. Greetings.
Yes. Thank you. Greetings.
Greetings, young Gil. Lovely to see you again.
Yes, great to see you.
So introduce your young Gil was hi, Robert, as well, down there.
Oh, Robert Bota from
South Africa.
Fantastic.
Hi, everybody.
And Keith,
Robert.
Keith, welcome. I can see your picture. Keith, that's Keith Aldred. And Paul Mills, our chair, RPI chair. And there's Nicolau as well. Okay, so anyway, so you know the book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea, which is Matthew played a large role in helping to put it all together and put it into a publishable form. It's written by Michael and a whole team of us as well, based on our thinking and reflection on the Korean question and ways forward for peace building in Korea. So without delaying, just hand over then to Matthew, who will be presenting it on PowerPoint. The proceedings will be recorded by Ruben.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And just to clarify before we start, of course, the book is on the reunification question between North and South Korea, but today's talk will primarily be focusing on the issues of fertility in South Korea, although with some commentary on North Korea as well. Next slide, please, Ruben. So those who take an interest in the affairs of the Korean Peninsula will likely already know that South Korea faces a population crisis. Headlines in Western newspapers regularly report on the latest slump in Korean birth rates or the difficulties of raising families there. You may know that South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world by a long stretch. Just last month, news channels reported that South Korea became a super-aged society in December 2024. That means 20% of the population is over 65 years old. But what does this all mean for South Korea and for the world? You might even think this is a good thing. Surely the world is overpopulated and needs to shrink. But today we'll take an in-depth look at South Korea's falling birth rate and aging population, looking at the causes, consequences, and solutions to demographic decline. Next slide, please, Ruben. First, a snapshot of South Korea as we enter 2025. Its population stands at 51.7 million, making it the world's 29th biggest country. For a country to sustain its population, its total fertility rate must be 2.1 children on average per woman of childbearing age. That is, if you take out other factors like lengthening life expectancy and immigration. As of 2023, South Korea's fertility rate is 0.72, with estimates suggesting a further fall to 0.68 in 2024. By comparison, the OECD average is 1.58, the USA's 1.62 and England's 1.44. But TFR is a less useful metric to show decline as growth. To demonstrate, Somalia has a TFR of 6. It's quite easy to imagine broods of 6 children and picture the country's pace of growth. But conceptualizing South Korea's 0.68 is a bit more difficult. It's tricky to imagine households with half a baby, unless you're King Solomon, perhaps. South Korea's TFR may appear numerically closer to replacement rates than Somalia's, but this is wrong. In terms of generational change, South Korea is shrinking at a faster rate than Somalia is growing. To illustrate South Korea's pace of decline, consider this graphic on the slide before you. A TFR of 0.68 over 2 generations means this. On the top line, we have the grandparents. 20 individuals make 10 couples. Collectively, they have 7 children. Those 7 children collectively have 2. So in just 2 generations, a cohort of 20 seniors has shrunk by 90% to 2. Now, this is obviously a simplified vision of how it changes within generations, but the point is made. Apply this across a country of 50 million and you understand the magnitude of South Korea's decline. Next slide, please, Ruben. How did we get here? South Korea's demographic history until recent decades is nothing remarkable. Emerging from Japanese occupation after the Korean War, South Korea was one of the world's most destitute nations. Political dictatorship, corruption, and lack of natural resources meant South Korea had an annual GDP per capita of $82 in the early 1960s, poorer than Ethiopia and Duvalier's Haiti. South Korea had a typical TFR, though, of a pre-modern economy at 6 babies per woman. This all changed with rapid economic transformation instigated by President Park Chung-hee in the 1960s. I should just say, as a side, apologies if I butcher any South Korean pronunciations. State investment in manufacturing, investment, and an export-led economy launched an economic miracle. By the early 1970s, South Korea's GDP had overtaken North Korea's. In 1988, Seoul was hosting the Olympic Games. In 2004, its GDP reached $1 trillion, cementing its place as an advanced economy. Yet, as with the swiftness of its economic growth, the country's fall in TFR was also dramatic. In 1960, the average woman had 6 children. By the Olympics 20 years later, this was 1.56. In Britain, this same change happened over 150 years. But South Korea was not finished. Its TFR would more than half in the next 35 years. Next slide, please, Ruben. The reason for South Korea's stunning fertility decline is complex and multifaceted. In many ways, South Korea's population is declining for the same causes as other high-income countries. Yet in others, the reasons are rooted in the peculiarities of South Korean history and culture. Birth rates are falling across much of the world due to numerous impacts of forces of decline. These are influences which discourage, hinder, or complicate the decision to have children. We can identify 5 categories of these forces with the acronym CRISES, as you see on the slide: cultural, religious, ideological, social, and economic forces. And some examples are there on the slides. Which forces of decline are most prominent in South Korea? As expected, they are myriad. But today's focus will be on what I consider to be the most influential factors, namely mass urbanization and housing shortages, long hours, career-first working culture, hyper-competitive education system, and the conflict between Confucian family traditions and modern individualism. Next slide, please, Ruben. South Korea's population grew exponentially between 1960 and 2020 from 20 million people to 52 million. Excluding micronations and small islands, South Korea is the world's 5th most densely populated country. This is despite the fact that only 30% of the country is habitable. Mass, rapid urbanization over the last few decades has been a significant cause of South Korea's fertility decline. City housing stock is smaller and not suited to big families. Competition for housing drives up property and rental costs, leaving little disposable income to raise children. Moreover, frequent mobility and anonymous housing blocks prevent local communities from forming, with many residents lacking support for childcare. Urban living also has knock-on cultural and ideological effects, such as pursuing careers over family, prioritizing personal interests over children, and making it difficult to form intimate relationships. Now, many countries are witnessing these effects. The situation in South Korea, however, is arguably more extreme, since urbanization is heavily concentrated in its capital city. Astonishingly, more than half of South Korea's entire population lives in the Seoul metropolitan area, 26 million people. By comparison, 14% of Britons live in London, 6% of Americans in New York. Centralizing wealth, jobs, political and cultural capital in one city has been instrumental in South Korea's baby drought. Estimates of Seoul's TFR in 2024 range from 0.55 to as low as 0.3. Moreover, the average housing cost in Seoul is around $645,000, 16.5 times the average annual salary. Whatever the other causes, South Korea will not see a rebound in births if young people cannot afford a home. The government has been aware of Seoul's contribution to crashing birth rates. The recently ousted president, Yoon Suk-yeol, sought to relocate the capital to a purpose-built city called Sejong, 75 miles south of Seoul. Sejong's construction began in 2003, and plans are to move the seats of government there, as well as setting up special economic zones. It's yet to be seen whether Sejong will spread economic opportunities across South Korea, but the attempt is surely welcome. Next slide, please, Ruben. One of the causes of decline that is particularly prominent in South Korea, as well as East Asia generally, is its demanding work culture. The commitment expected of a South Korean company employee is notorious. Officially, working weeks are capped at 40 hours with maximum 12 hours overtime. However, South Koreans work 6 to 13 hours more per week than the OECD average, often including weekends. Yet working hours are just half the story. Workers are expected to partake in regular after-hours drinking sessions with superiors, known as hosik. Although hosik has declined somewhat, South Korea still has one of the world's highest alcohol consumption rates. In South Korean tradition, work is often given primacy over other commitments. It is true that South Korea's rapid economic success was built on this hard-working and in many ways admirable spirit. Yet this blessing has become a burden, as South Koreans today feel burnt out and unable to dedicate time towards family. The strictly hierarchical nature of corporate relationships, as well as the dominance of the South Korean economy by a handful of mega conglomerates like Samsung and LG, mean that change is difficult. A particular issue has been adjusting to the entry of women into the workforce en masse. In Confucian tradition, men and women are governed by strict gender roles. Women are expected often to give up work upon marriage or pregnancy to devote oneself to domesticity. However, in the last generation, female labour force participation has increased by 12 points to 64%. Yet it often remains ingrained in the South Korean psyche that motherhood and work can conflict. Thus, many women choose career over motherhood if they can't have both. Similar thinking persists in Japan and China, despite efforts to foster cultural change through political action. This may well explain why fertility rates are lower in East Asia than in Europe, where there is greater compatibility between work and parenthood. Next slide, please, Ruben. The stress of South Korean life is not limited to the workplace. It's a cradle-to-grave phenomenon. As in other East Asian countries, children's education is highly prized. South Korea routinely ranks towards top of international education metrics. 70% of South Koreans aged 25 to 34 have completed tertiary education, the highest in the OECD. Educational attainment is the bedrock of the technologically sophisticated South Korean economy. However, the competitive nature of the education system has intensified to extreme lengths. As South Korea transitioned from an agrarian to industrial, high-tech economy, the intellectuality demanded of its workforce has increased. This has spurred a hyper-competitive childhood for the South Korean youth, with out-of-hours private tuition dominating their spare time. South Koreans spend $20 billion on private education each year. Secondary students attend school often from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., only to spend hours thereafter in cram schools known as hagwon. Even 80% of primary students receive some form of private tutoring, with many families dedicating a fifth of household income to this. Little wonder then that South Korea is the world's most expensive country to raise a child to adulthood. On average, 7.8 times GDP per capita, compared to 3.6 times in Germany and 2.1 times in Australia. Expectations of educational attainment place pressure on both parents and children. For parents, the commitment of money and time is immense, on top of the crunch they already feel at work. For children, their lives can be miserable experiences with little time for friends or leisure. A 2023 study estimated that 26% of South Korea's birth drop rate in recent years was due to education costs. Parents who do have families are more likely to have just one child, dedicating all resources to them. Next slide, please, Ruben. One of the core difficulties in South Korea is the tension between Confucian tradition and a hyper-competitive capitalist culture. Confucianism values order and harmony within relationships, prioritizing responsibilities.
I can't hear it.
Can anybody else not hear me? Hello?
I'm
Hi.
hearing.
You can hear okay. Okay,
Yes.
I'll carry on. Hopefully, whoever raised their voice will be able to solve the issue. Back to Confucianism. Confucianism values harmony within relationships, emphasizing obligations. Amongst its most prominent principles is filial piety, emphasizing the respect and care that children owe to parents, a cornerstone of societal harmony. Capitalism and individualism, on the other hand, focus on individual choice and pursuits, the promotion of personal rights over relational obligations. This tension has been disruptive for relationships in South Korea. For demographic decline, the relationship most damaged has been between men and women. For South Korea's increasingly liberal-minded young women, Confucian expectations are restrictive and outdated. There is still a widely held expectation that Korean women will give up work upon childbearing. South Korean women are expected to handle the lion's share of household work, including childcare as well as care of elderly relatives. Studies show women spend 420 minutes a day on housework, compared to 63 for men. This is despite growing female employment. Additionally, sexual prejudice is common, especially in work. A quarter of women report experiencing workplace sexual harassment, most often from male superiors, exacerbated by the drinking culture. Today's generation of young women are attracted to feminist ideals and increasingly reject Confucian expectations. Yet young men also feel disillusioned. The hyper-competitive culture introduced following the 1997 economic crisis has made it a struggle to fulfill traditional male roles of household provision. Young South Korean men have been blighted by low wages, high unemployment, and precarious work, all of which makes supporting families a daunting prospect. A record 400,000 people aged 15 to 29 have withdrawn from the job market altogether. Simultaneously, many young men feel that women are being unfairly advantaged. A common gripe is that men are conscripted for 18 to 21 months military service, while women are not. Many feel this gives women a leg up in their careers and earnings. All of this, unfortunately, is spilling into a gender war. The 2022 presidential election saw an openly anti-feminist candidate win by channeling the frustrations of young men. Meanwhile, young women have responded with the so-called 4B movement, meaning the 4 no's: no dating, sex, marriage, or childbirth. This tension has frustrated couple formation in South Korea. A society's future depends on the mutual affection and cooperation between men and women, as is obvious. However, in South Korea, this relationship is bruised, with social media echo chambers worsening matters. As men and women's political and ideological values diverge, governments will find it difficult to heal the divide. All of these causes of decline are not exhaustive, but they go some way to explain the uniquely challenging situation faced by South Korea. In this next section, I will describe some of the consequences of their persistently low birth rate, which will impact every facet of life. Next slide, please, Ruben. As mentioned, demographic decline entails a growing number of older people, but a shrinking base of younger people. This will have drastic ramifications for South Korea's economic and fiscal model. Fewer workers means the country will be less able to produce the goods and services it needs to function, including amenities like health and social care. The growing elderly population will find a shortage of doctors and carers. At the same time, a great deal of manpower and investment will be diverted from the dynamic parts of South Korea's economy, like technological development, to social care, further stunting its economic outlook. At the same time, South Korea will have fewer taxpayers to fund ballooning costs. The key metric here is the old age dependency ratio, which measures the number of those aged over 65 per 100 working people. In 1960, in South Korea, there were 5.3 over 65s for every 100 workers. In 2000, 10.1. In 2024, 27.4. This number will more than double to 59 by 2040 and an astonishing 103 by 2070. South Korea in 1960 experienced a demographic dividend, an abundance of workers with very few pensioners needing welfare. This helped propel the country to an economic miracle. Today, however, South Korea faces demographic deficit. Working-age South Koreans will be under immense pressure to generate taxable income, thus exacerbating the causes depressing birth rates in the first place. Demographic decline, sadly, is self-reinforcing. Next slide, please, Ruben. The main challenge facing the South Korean government is funding old age pensions and care. The sustainability of state pensions depends on there being a higher ratio of contributions to withdrawals. With a growing elderly population, there will be increasing pressure on pension funds to meet demand. Many countries are facing these pressures, of course. However, South Korea is particularly vulnerable due to the structure of its pensions. In 1987, the newly democratic government set up the National Pension Service, NPS, to provide annuities to elderly citizens. Today, the NPS is the third largest pension fund in the world, covering 22 million people and managing nearly a quadrillion Korean won, that's 800 billion US dollars. South Korean employees must contribute 9% of earnings for at least 10 years, split with their employer. The pensionable age is currently 62, rising to 65 by 2023, amongst the lowest in the OECD. The relative recency of public pensions, combined with low contributions and an early retirement age, make for grim reading for the NPS. Not only are the number of pensioners growing, so too is the time they spend in retirement. Men spend 18.5 years on pension, women 23. This is an increase of 4 years in just half a decade. On current projections, the NPS will be in deficit by 2041 and depleted by 2055. More alarming here is the fact that South Korea already struggles with high rates of elderly poverty, at over 40% of senior citizens, compared to the OECD's 15%. To make matters worse, South Koreans have insufficient savings. Private pensions amount to 32% of GDP in South Korea, compared to 100% across the OECD. On top of this are health and social care costs. South Korea's medical insurance system is already creaking under the imbalance between demand and supply. The ratio of doctors per 1,000 people at 2.1 is far below the 3.7 average across the high-income world. Given the rate of South Korea's aging, this is a serious concern. South Korea's life expectancy at 83 is forecast to increase by another decade this century. However, across the world, health span is not keeping up with lifespan. As people age, the number of ailments and disabilities increases greatly, as does the need for expensive treatments and round-the-clock care. Next slide, please, Ruben. Another big concern for South Korean lawmakers is the implication for national defense. Despite a 70-year-long ceasefire, North Korea and South Korea remain officially at war. The complicated relationship between the two Koreas is of course beyond scope today. But briefly, South Korean policy is to be on a war footing such that it could repel invasion from the north if necessary. Following recent escalations, South Korea has pledged to boost defense spending by $260 billion in the next 5 years. Including active personnel and reserves, South Korea has the world's second largest army at 6.7 million, second only to North Korea's estimated 7.8 million soldiers. Rapid demographic decline in South Korea could mean a weakening of its armed forces. A drastic reduction in troops will make South Korea less capable of resisting aggression. Indeed, given worker shortages and tax shortfalls, many will question whether South Korea has the resources to commit all young men to 2 years military service. A shrinking army may result in South Korea becoming more reliant on international partnerships, such as the Trilateral Security Pact agreed with Japan and the US in 2023. Given the geopolitical hotspots in the Korean DMZ and the nearby Taiwan, this will be a significant concern to South Korea's allies. Next slide, please, Ruben. Finally, South Korea's ageing society will lead to serious social and relational disruption. A heavily skewed old age dependency ratio not only has economic consequences, but also distorts relationships. As mentioned before, 20 elderly citizens will produce just 2 grandchildren. This will profoundly affect the intergenerational dynamic and lead to a relationally poorer society. Due to its highly urbanized and anonymized society, South Korea suffers from a loneliness epidemic. Single occupancy households will surpass 40% of households by 2050. The Korean language even has a word for death from loneliness, godoksa, killing almost 4,000 people each year and growing. Last year, Seoul authorities committed $330 million to making the city loneliness-free by 2030. Yet loneliness in South Korea is not simply a matter of being alone. Rather, it includes not finding fulfillment in one's relationships. South Korea's hyper-competitive culture in academics, career, sport, or beauty pits citizen against citizen. Such a heated environment is not conducive to healthy relationships, which are about reciprocity, compassion, and love. However, with a numerical imbalance between young and old, the ancient ties of filial piety may break down. Many elderly people will spend their later years in loneliness, boredom, and grief, with having no family being the norm rather than the exception. A super-aged society also has consequences for politics and democracy. The senior cohort will substantially outnumber the young and middle-aged, with election outcomes skewing towards elderly interests. Since 2024, the over 60s make up the largest subset of voters at 31%. As in other countries, young voters may come to feel disillusioned with the political system, or even with democracy itself, threatening instability or even revolution. Next slide, please, Ruben. Demographic decline on the scale and speed of South Korea is truly unprecedented. We have no idea how our societies will react. Human history is replete with terrible atrocities in response to novel threats. Who knows how our 21st century secular societies will respond to demographic decline? Could we once again see a re-emergence of our darkest instincts? It's not outlandish to imagine scenarios where, say, mandatory euthanasia is introduced for those aged 75 in the name of saving the nation. In fact, a 2022 Japanese film called Plan 75 conjures up this reality in an unnervingly plausible light. It is required viewing. We hope and pray that our leaders and institutions will suppress such instincts, but the human record is not a reassuring one. Next slide, please, Ruben. Before exploring some possible solutions for South Korea, it is worth looking at the situation in North Korea, briefly. North Korea's population is half of South Korea's at 26.5 million. Like South Korea, North Korea is struggling to reverse falling fertility rates. North Korea's TFR is estimated to be 1.7 to 1.8, below replacement levels. I should just say for note that any statistics from North Korea will be estimates based on the best resources available. Although a 1.7 TFR would be enviable for a developed Western country, North Korean realities make this a worrying development. In a rare display of emotion in May 2024, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, wiped away tears while urging the women of North Korea to have more children. He declared that stopping the declining birth rate was a priority of his government, making ideological appeals to young couples. Declining births is a problem for North Korea since their economy and national defense depend upon surplus of manpower. As an industrial and agrarian economy often lacking in advanced technology, North Korean production is labour-intensive. The same is true of its army, compensating for dated technology in sheer numbers, with a standing army of 1.3 million. Therefore, any drop in working-age population can seriously undermine the state's functioning. On current trends, North Korea's working-age population will decline by 2030. Since the famine of the 1990s, the North Korean welfare state has largely broken down, with stable employment, pensions, and food rations now unreliable at best. Legally, the state commits to providing pensions and healthcare to its elderly. In reality, many senior citizens resort to black market activities for sustenance. A declining workforce would further deplete revenues from state-owned industries, worsening state welfare provision. But North Korea's political system makes mitigating the effects of population decline uniquely challenging. Importing migrant workers is a non-starter. On the contrary, North Korea depends on exporting labourers to China, Russia, and beyond in order to send back remittances in foreign currency. Government borrowing or international investment is also not an option. Improving productivity in the economy through investment and innovation will require currently inconceivable shifts in state policy. Despite the many differences between North and South Korea, as you'll all know, demographic decline is a challenge that they share. Next slide, please, Ruben. So, what is to be done to reverse demographic decline? The South Korean government has spent over $200 billion in 2 decades with generous grants to parents, capping legal working hours, strengthening paternity leave, and even state-sponsored dating parties for young singles. But nothing has worked, on the contrary. As with countries like Japan, China, and Hungary, the South Korean government has treated falling birth rates as a primarily economic or a financial problem. However, as shown today, the issue is multifaceted. Addressing it will require creativity, a willingness to confront vested interests, and above all, an embrace of a relationship-centred agenda. Next slide, please, Ruben. One solution with immense potential for not only improving the birth rate, but also addressing elderly care is family co-location, extended family co-location. Co-location means enabling extended family members to move within geographic proximity of one another. Excessive mobility in South Korea, particularly to Seoul, has weakened traditional support structures, leaving young families isolated. Meanwhile, elderly citizens suffer from loneliness as local authorities struggle to meet demand in rural areas. Co-location channels God-given strengths of families, restores local communities, and alleviates state tax burdens. Having grandparents and siblings nearby provides numerous benefits to childbearing. The only high-income country with a TFR above replacement levels is Israel. Although in many ways Israel is demographically unique given its history and religious values, one of the recognized contributors to Israel's fertility success is the country's small size. Relatives are never far away to provide support. Government policy can incentivize families to co-locate. The Singaporean government, for instance, offers subsidies and tax reliefs, like the proximity housing grant of 20,000 Singaporean dollars towards the purchase of a property within 4 kilometres of one's parents' home. Given the unaffordability of urban housing, similar grants could be attractive to young South Koreans keen to get on the housing ladder. Next slide, please, Ruben. However, co-location incentives on their own will be inadequate while areas outside Seoul suffer low economic development. The Seoul capital area generates $1 trillion a year, half the country's GDP. Seoul's high salary, prestigious jobs, and cultural clout mean the regions simply can't compete. Young people piling into urban centres is a catalyst for many of the forces of decline. Pressure on housing stock, separation of families, long commutes. Governments need to find ways to incentivise young people to build careers and start families in their hometowns, while spreading economic opportunities to those areas. A core policy could be encouraging students to enrol in local universities through tuition fee reductions and bursaries. Companies could also receive tax incentives to hire local graduates. Although comparatively fewer South Koreans leave home for university, between a quarter and a third do move, and many relocate for their first job. By enticing young people to stay at home in these important years, they are more likely to form roots and networks, ensuring they build livelihoods locally. Rural regeneration will be more challenging. Fiscal redistribution in infrastructure and public services to poorer regions will of course be important. South Korea does have redistributive structures like the local share tax, but this only accounts for a small proportion of national taxation. An example to emulate would be Switzerland's successful policy of national fiscal equalization, where richer cantons or regions distribute tax receipts to poorer cantons, thus levelling up the whole country. The South Korean government will also need to commit more resources towards spreading economic investment currently concentrated in Seoul, such as their project in Sejong City I mentioned earlier. Other options include utilising benefits of remote working, ushered in at scale during COVID-19. The fact that many workers have jobs which require less time spent physically in the office presents opportunities not to mandate worker relocation as the norm. At present, workers in Seoul spend on average 83 minutes a day commuting and 9.3 hours in the office. This is obviously prohibitive towards childcare, where time is indispensable. However, a FaceTime culture is deeply ingrained in South Korea's corporates, with junior workers feeling bound not to leave before superiors. Confronting this will require fundamental cultural change in South Korea, with leadership by example from the government, enforceable laws protecting family time, and meaningful incentives to corporates to adapt. Of course, this is a very difficult area, as companies have legitimate growth targets and relational priorities which could be compromised by remote working. It is also a double-edged sword, as remote working can cause intrusion of work into family time. These concerns are of course understandable, and a workable balance must be struck. However, what is unarguable is that the present situation is harmful to family time. South Korea must decide in this trade-off whether they lean towards economic growth or families, particularly given their demographic crisis. Next slide, please, Ruben. As Dr. Michael Schluter often says, time is the currency of relationships. In many ways, South Korea has achieved startling economic growth, but at the cost of people's time. Just as industries require finance to grow, so relationships need time and commitment. In South Korea, the demands of education, work, and social media are a chokehold on people's time, denying them chances to cultivate ties with family and friends. In many ways, South Korean competitiveness and hard work derive from admirable Confucian values. However, it is clear that these virtues have become idols, with families the collateral damage. Unless South Koreans can challenge cultural convention and create time for relationships, demographic decline will only worsen. This begins with children's education. The hyper-competitive schooling system is clearly denting parents' ability to have children, while imposing undue pressure on young children to succeed academically. Given it is culturally instilled to put children through private tutoring, there may be no alternative but to crack down on hagwons through law. In 2021, the Chinese government introduced severe restrictions on the private tuition sector, forbidding companies from being for-profit entities, strictly regulating their fees, and banning classes during weekends and holidays. South Korea's regulations, by comparison, have been soft, only restricting cram school classes later than 10 p.m. Following China's lead will be uncomfortable, especially in South Korea's democratic capitalist system. However, with South Korea's demographics becoming an existential risk, they may have little choice but radical action. Then there is the long hours working culture. Unless companies treat employees' relational duties with equal priority to financial success, workers will remain priced out of having families. This is not to say that companies should disincentivize hard work and corporate loyalty. Far from it. However, it requires a cultural shift towards respecting workers' parental leave and annual holidays, forbidding excessive overtime, shifting away from a FaceTime culture, and giving flexibility to working parents where possible. Moreover, the South Korean government could consider enshrining a right to family time in law, forbidding companies from discriminating against workers who choose not to participate in after-work drinking sessions. Next slide, please, Ruben. To finish this seminar today, it's important to note that in many ways, South Korea is already past the point of no return. Their TFR has been below replacement levels for far too long. Even if fertility rates miraculously recover to 2.1 this year, the country will still not escape the consequences. Decline is multi-generational, but so is recovery. This does not for a moment mean that South Korea should give up boosting its birth rate. However, in the short term, it does mean adapting to a super-age society. For instance, South Korea will need to raise the retirement age, while boosting health outcomes in the young and middle age to lengthen healthy life years. There will also need to be continued investment in technologies, improving productivity per head while using AI and other innovations to alleviate shortfalls in human capital. Yet there is no way around the fact that South Korea will require increased migration to fill essential vacancies and generate taxes. Already, the country has boosted migration from countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. But being a highly homogeneous country, South Korea is hesitant towards mass migration as seen in Western countries. As such, the country has sought to reintegrate Korean diaspora, or Koryoin, who had migrated to the Russian Empire in the 19th century. 760,000 Koryoin now live in South Korea, filling vacancy in industry and services. However, as most of this community are culturally and linguistically Russian or Central Asian, there are difficulties integrating them into South Korean society. In looking for culturally and ethnically Korean workers, South Korea may take the radical step of considering closer cooperation or even step towards reunification with North Korea. In many ways, both Koreas share problems that could be alleviated by collaboration and synergy. South Korea needs Korean workers to fill vacancies, while North Korea requires investment to enhance workforce productivity. Given the substantial challenges both governments face, they may look to the considerable benefits that a peace dividend would bring, not least in diverting human capital away from its armed forces. Of course, this may seem far-fetched to many of you today, but as Jeremy introduced at the beginning, for a relational proposal on what achieving peace and reconciliation between the Koreas in incremental steps might look like, I would highly recommend the book introduced at the beginning, Dr. Michael Schluter's 2022 book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea. Next slide, please, Ruben. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. I'd be more than happy to take questions. And Michael has also offered to field questions which might require a more specialist understanding of South Korea and North Korea. Thank you. You're on mute, Jeremy, if you're trying to talk.
Unmute. Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. That was a very concise and very well presented presentation. Michael, do you want to give a quick response, and then I'll open it to questions, which will also have to be very brief, I'm afraid.
I'd just like to say that I thought it was an excellent presentation, Matthew. Thank you very much. It's complex because of this interplay between the cultural factors and the economic factors. But I would agree with you, and obviously you quoted me in saying it, that time is the currency of relationship. And if you can't free up time for particularly younger South Koreans to have dating opportunities and an opportunity to have social engagement with their peers, then it's going to be very difficult to reverse the decline in population. And I think
gone again.
And I think you are absolutely right as well. I remember talking to a former research assistant from South Korea who said that she reckoned that they needed $100,000 US to be able to raise a child in South Korea.
I've lost Luch again.
And therefore, I think
What have I done now?
That's a serious constraint on them having more children. So yeah, I think you've hit all the right buttons on this in terms of, well, how do we tackle it then? And it is going to require a really significant cultural shift.
Nicholas?
Yep. Thinking from the Christian point of view, yes, there is a cultural challenge with Confucianism, but haven't we as church Christians, there are so many Christians, the problem is really letting your Christian values interact or overcome the Confucian values, so that in many ways folk may be Christian by attending church, but Confucian in their philosophical thinking. And we obviously worked with was working with Script Union to integrate how we lived out our Christian lives.
Oh,
Now, this is a key factor, I think.
Thank you, Nicholas. Would Michael? Briefly.
Michael, yes, please.
I can't even hear.
I was wondering actually whether we could ask Young Gil Lee if he might comment on that. If
Yes,
I may.
please.
Yes, Young Gil, what do you think?
You're on mute, Young Gil. You're on mute.
You need to be unmuted.
There we are. Good. Yep.
Okay. Instead of having a comment about it, I really appreciate Matthew's presentation and his level of depth in understanding Korean culture. So thank you so much for your interest in Korean issues. And it's amazing that you even know Korean language, very difficult Korean language like Godokta and some other languages. It's
You're
amazing.
very kind. Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind.
So you know Korean? I mean, you communicate in Korean language?
Okay.
No, I don't. Interestingly,
sorry, I must stop this conversation because we need to really focus on the question.
Okay. All right. So now my question is, I have a question. For in order to reach out to solution, which one do you think most effective between a cultural transformation and public policy incentives?
That's a brilliant question, because I think, as I said, a lot of the issues can be helped by government, but a lot of the changes have to come from the grassroots up. The government can't do everything. And what's interesting is if you look at countries across the world like China, where governments have a lot more power, or North Korea, than democratic governments, they are struggling just the same way, if not even more. It turns out it's much easier to stop people having children, as with the one-child policy, than to encourage people. So I think both need to work in tandem. So I think from the political side, yes, things like capping work hours, government leaders leading by example, for instance, in taking paternity leave or maternity leave and respecting that, or government actions such as reinvesting in rural areas. That's something that governments can do. But when we talk about Confucian values and these sort of grassroots issues, well, I think the only answer I could say is that that's one place where the church has to step up. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure what the percentage of South Koreans are Christians at the moment. But it's a substantial minority. There's a great opportunity there for, churches in Western countries. It's great to see are involved in creche activities, supporting young parents, giving young parents a place to meet. And I think really that's an opportunity for the church to lead the charge there and transform the Korean culture. I think that's an excellent opportunity, both on the demographic front and the evangelism front. So it'd be great to hear South Korean churches with ideas there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'd like to make just a very brief comment. The size and scale and influence of the chaebols is very significant, these huge companies. And I would have thought the way that South Korean culture and politics works, as I've experienced it, is that if the government gets together the heads of these large companies and says, look, we have to collectively, in the national interest, shift the working hours culture, we have to make sure that we are supporting childbearing and the time that couples can spend together and restrict the working hours and everything else. If they come together with the leaders of these large companies and collectively decide that we're going to do that in a way which we could not consider doing in the West because we're too individualistic and competitive. But I think in the South Korean culture, I think it could be done. I'd like to hear Young Gil's view, but I think it could be done. Then I think the government working with the leaders of these huge, the 5 biggest companies could really shift the working culture in a way that would have an impact on the birth rate.
So, Young Girl, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I simply do not know, but if we can make a social trend, in such a way that influence upon the large conglomerates' attitude toward the social values, I think it will happen. That's right, that Korean society is still in a conservative and Confucius culture that emphasize on relationship. So it may not be that difficult compared to the Western countries. But of course, we have our own challenge, especially among companies. Large companies spin deeply, inbuilt in capitalist orientation. So, we should try, and we have to see.
Thank you. What about something from the North Korean perspective? Ian and Helen, do you want to say anything briefly? From your experience of living in North Korea?
Yes, I think two things we'd like to say immediately. One is one of the things we noticed just driving around Pyongyang and going out there casually is the huge emphasis on care for children, building schools, all the children in uniform, and then at the weekends being taken out, interestingly, by the teachers in groups along the river. There's a very child family focused. Would you agree, Dan?
Yes, and things like the Children's Palace as well, with
Yeah.
all the extra activities.
Yes.
But from what we saw, there did seem to be rather more in the way of integration. I mean, things we went to that parents were there, parents were collecting their children.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were just observing day-to-day life. I mean, these weren't things that were put on for our benefit. So maybe they do, in some ways, have a more child-oriented society.
Yeah. And again, their university education on the next step was huge. There's a huge number of universities in Pyongyang, often very specialized ones. So a university for the railroads, for example. We were obviously involved with on the health side, visiting hospitals. But the other point we would make, I think, a practical one, is were suddenly the miracle to happen and the barriers could come down. Right now, North Korea has an excess of doctors. They train more doctors than they can employ. It would be wonderful if those doctors could go and work in the South. And also, North Korea has a fully set up and working what we would call general practice medical system in what we call doctors in the communities, rather than South Korea, which relies on people going to hospitals, even for the beginning of a health problem. And so if those two things could be exported to the South, instantly you would have the foundation for being able to cope with a move towards families having more children.
Thank you, Ian. Now, I think Matthew and Michael, would you like to wrap up this discussion at this point?
Yes, I think the only other point that I'd like to make may seem a little self-serving, but I do explore a lot of those issues, including particularly the ones that Ian and Helen Wells have mentioned in terms of the health system and so on, in comparing what is happening in North Korea at the moment and what is happening in South Korea at the moment. And I went to a seminar in Cambridge recently which emphasized the differences between North and South Korea, but I was pleading with them to look at the similarities between North and South Korea. I mean, North and South Korea are all made up of Koreans, and actually there are some very deep fundamental values leading to a lot of similarities in the mindset and outlook of North and South Korea. And I just think every effort to try and bring alignment between the goals in education and healthcare and so on, and across the society between North and South Korea, are all going to be steps towards the reunification, which ultimately will resolve many of these problems, I believe. So let's keep our minds, and if we're Christians, our prayers on the priority of achieving reunification of the peninsula.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Matthew, do you want to say anything?
Thank you, Michael. I think it's difficult to improve on that, but I just think it's worth wrapping up by saying demographic decline is truly a global phenomenon. South Korea has it worse than almost every other country, but Europe, even the Middle East, all across the world, we're seeing falling fertility rates, and governments across the world have been throwing money at the problem. It's not been doing anything. We really need boldness. We need courage. It won't be comfortable confronting these deeply entrenched cultural values and vested interests, but South Korea has no choice. It is existential, the risks. And if it doesn't face the discomfort now, well, it will be a lot more uncomfortable in 10 and 20 years' time. And that's just a call for a relationship-centered agenda. I really think the more I read into it, the more I see the potential that the cause for demographic decline really is broken relationships across society, and that healing those will go a long way, if not the full way, to recovering the problem.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you, Matthew, for your excellent presentation.